For my presentation, I'm going to be looking at Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. My working title right now is Dickens as Deconstructionist, a Revolutionary Overthrow of Science Systems. So just to get us situated a little bit, I'll set the scene. We come in right at the onset of the French Revolution, and we get to see some of the sort of inciting factors, the cruelty of the French aristocracy against the peasants, but also this nascent revolutionary movement as it forms in the streets of Paris. We also spend a lot of time in London, where many of our main characters live. And these characters sort of get caught in the middle of this ongoing revolution. We have Charles Darnay, a French aristocrat who swears off his title. We have Dr. Manette, a physician who is, at the very beginning of the novel, released from prison in the Bastille. His daughter, Lucy Manette, who ends up marrying Charles Darnay, and Sidney Carton, an English barrister, who, by the end of the novel, takes Darnay's place at the guillotine. Obviously, I'm looking at this novel in terms of deconstruction. For anyone who's read Dickens, you will be well aware that he is very fond of understanding how language works, little idiosyncrasies in language very often. But I think he really goes a bit further than just having a bit of fun with language. He's interested in how language works and interested in science systems more broadly. And I think in this novel in particular, he's constantly undermining the authority of language, and he's pointing out how artificial these science systems are in a lot of ways. And I think he accomplishes those tasks in three main ways. Firstly, by drawing attention to the instability of the binary oppositions that science systems are based on, by highlighting secret signs and esoteric symbols, and also by portraying the futility of communication between his characters. In a way, he deconstructs his characters. So we'll start right at the beginning, and these are very, very famous lines where he just sort of establishes the mood. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity, it was the season of light, it was the season of darkness, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In both countries, and that being England and France, and London and Paris being the two cities, of course, of the title. It was clearer than crystal to the lords of the state, preservers of loaves and fishes, that things in general were settled forever. And so this is one of those examples of where Dickens is really having a lot of fun with language. But I do think this is a very important quotation for a lot of reasons. He's using these contrasting opposites over and over and over again, and ad nauseum. Quite honestly, what he's drawing attention to is these binary oppositions. And just a quick rundown, because this is such an important concept for structuralists, for post-structuralists, and specifically for my paper. It's the notion that words and symbolic concepts are primarily defined, and maybe can only be defined by their opposites. London is not Paris, that should say Paris, not France, excuse me. Spring is not winter, darkness is not light, so on and so forth for all of these opposites that he's laid out here. But the authority of these oppositions are said to be clearer than crystal and settled forever in the minds of the Ancien Regime aristocrats, But I don't think we really read it that way. I think when we read those opening paragraphs, we're left sort of wondering, how can both of these things exist at once? How can the period, the chapter is titled The Period, how can the period be both the best and the worst? So we get a very unstable introduction to this linguistic opposition that I think defines the way he works with linguistic oppositions throughout. So here's some of these questions that I think are reasonably asked and are intended to be asked in the mind of the reader. We don't even know what this period is. What is this period? Is it the period of the Revolution? Is it the pre-revolutionary Ancien Regime period? Is it the period of the novel itself? But more importantly, how can this period, whatever it might be defined by both sides of a binary opposition at the same time? Definitionally, these opposites cannot coexist. It cannot be the best and the worst simultaneously, yet Dickens is insisting that it was. And finally, how could we agree on what the best of these times even is? Which parts make it the best? Which parts make it the worst? But without any satisfying answers, without any conclusive answers, without any stable answers, we can't put any faith in the ability of these linguistic oppositions to convey stable meaning. The words themselves start to break down. What does the best even mean, then, if it can be used so loosely and so broadly? How can we ever get to the underpinning of what is being signified by the word best? And the simple answer is we cannot. Here's an interesting quote from Paul Davis, a scholar. The novel's opening sentence calls attention to itself by its sheer length, 120 words, and its rhetorical structure. Its bold and antithetical assertions invite oration, but the longer it goes on, the less it seems to be about the 18th century, that would be the period, and here Davis is making an assumption that it is, in fact, the entire 18th century, which I think is a little bit uncalled for. Nevertheless, the more it seems to be about itself as a sentence, a period. And that's really interesting, the sort of metatextual aspect of this opening sentence. And I think this reflexive view of language sets up our understanding for the novel writ large. Here's Davis again. The novel's self-conscious narrative is marked by instability. Words are shown to be very unstable signifiers of meaning. Again and again, we're left to just guess at the meaning of a lot of these obscure and secret signals. One of the opening scenes, we have Jarvis Lorry. He's a banker, and he receives a message while he's riding at night, and the messenger is Jerry Cruncher, who becomes a rather prominent character. And he reads out this letter, and Laurie just tells Jerry that his answer is recalled to life. But at the time of reading, we're not clear on what this phrase means, and we see characters interpret it differently. Jerry Cruncher, the messenger, he's startled, terrified. He interprets this phrase as a literal resurrection. He's a grave robber by trade, at least in the evening hours, and he interprets it that way. Laura's recipients at Tellson's bank, they take this message to mean that Dr. Manette, who I mentioned earlier, has been freed from the Bastille, because they have the context of the situation in France, Paris, France. Cruncher later, this is very interesting, I think, he later uses this same exact phrase, recalled to life, referring to the acquittal of Darnay in London. He was accused of being a French spy, and he was acquitted. We see how the meaning of this same phrase changes and evolves and is never the same, depending on who is the receiver of this message. There is no stable meaning. It's a very simple phrase. It's 4 syllables only, but it means, Laurie himself admits, it may mean anything at all. Um, so here, I think by saying it, it could mean anything. Dickens is really showing just how um, unstable language is as a medium of communication. And I think it really is, pardon the pun here, a revolutionary stance. He's not saying it might mean quite a lot of things, but anything at all. So we can see the ways in which this signifier is inducing in recipients of the message this semiotic play. They think of different symbols and different images and are trying to make these connections without ever getting to the heart of the matter. Jerry Cruncher recalled to life. From life he thinks death. From death he thinks graveyards. From graveyards he thinks corpses. And that's a perfectly reasonable, I think, chain of signifiers for him to connect there. But what he arrives at is a meaning wholly different from what the sender intended, right? And in the absence of authorial intent, as very often we don't have the luxury of that in the narrative, right? Laurie never says what he intended by that. We have to actually piece it together ourselves, which is quite interesting. Here's a quote from scholar Jim Barloon. Throughout A Tale of Two Cities, and in divers ways, referentiality itself is questioned, or at least shown to be contestable. The world of the novel is hard to read, as are the words that stand for things in that world. Even the names that appear, and those that do not, reveal a breach between signifier and signified, a radical disjuncture between word and referent. Moving on from there, we also have the Jacquerie. The peasant uprisings in France were often termed the Jacquerie. Jacques just being a common low-class male name in French, and the revolutionaries in A Tale of Two Cities use this to their advantage. They refer to each other when recognizing each other as revolutionaries as Jacques, no matter what their actual given name is. So we see this disjuncture of word and referent that Barloon was referencing there. We see this radical disjuncture of signifier and signified in this name. The signified can be, and often is in different contexts, Monsieur Defarge, one of the most prominent revolutionaries in the novel. His name is Ernest, and yet he is referred to many, many times as Jacques, and only as Jacques. He has 3 fellows at the wine shop who are occasionally, but not always, referred to as Jacques I, Jacques II, and Jacques III. Aristocrat, Marquis Saint-Evremont, who is Darnay's uncle, is killed, and a note left on his body says, this from Jacques. So the assassin is Jacques. There's this mender of roads who later becomes a wood sawyer, and he's another prominent revolutionary. But he is never given a name. He is only referred to as Jacques or the mender of roads, but also thousands more, we're told. Here's a quote from scholar John Bowen that I think is interesting. The way that this single signifier, Jacques, prompts this almost endless proliferation of signifieds. It scales from just Defarge and his sort of posse of 3 to these thousands in the Bastille. Bowen says, these numbers, their sequencing, instability, combination, division, and transformation, and the question of what they may mean, will echo through the novel, heard and unheard, seen and unseen. They are both named and unnamed by the generic Jacques. Since Dickens makes such a strong point by using a personal name, a given name, as sort of an instrument of deconstruction, I think it's worthwhile to look at the characters themselves, how these characters are deconstructed, and speaking more broadly, how the subject is deconstructed. Here's a quote that I think is incredibly important to understanding the novel, very early on in the novel. Every human creature is constituted to be that profound secret and mystery to every other. Something of the awfulness, even of death itself, is referable to this. No more can I turn the leaves of this dear book that I loved, and vainly hope in time to read it all. No more can I look into the depths of this unfathomable water, wherein, as momentary lights glanced into it, I have had glimpses of buried treasure and other things submerged. It was appointed that the book should shut with a spring, forever and forever, when I had read but a page. So not only do we have secret signals, but we have secret subjects. Um, every person is that profound secret and mystery to every other. And the metaphor here of the subject is made explicitly textual. He compares the subject to a book that we read and never understand. The true nature within the what you might say the true meaning of this book is sort of the ultimate essence. It's the ultimate signified, but it's completely elusive. Meaning is irreducible. It can't be gleaned in any conclusive manner. What we're left with is just a surface level suggestion, which Dickens writes as being the light dancing atop water, or just the briefest glance at a page. And those I would consider in this context signifiers, which of course can never get to that true, essential, submerged, signified. Sidney Carton is one of the most interesting and most important characters, and the deconstruction of the subject very often takes the form of misrecognition. Carton's probably the best example of this. He is described to be incredibly disorganized, disheveled, his hair is long and floppy, but he's also a very talented barrister. And these are points made by scholar Simon Petch here. He's a social outcast in a lot of ways, but he's also an elite professional. In England, he has a higher social standing than Charles Darnay, who is often his foil, sort of neat, tidy, handsome, attractive. He's a clown. Very often he is used sort of as comic relief, but he's also the novel's primary hero, according to Petch. And of course, at the end of the novel, he is taken to be Darnay by the revolutionaries at the guillotine when he is executed in Darnay's stead. So the way in which these simple signifiers, that being Darnay's outward appearance and Carton's outward appearance, because they both they look almost identical. These outward signifiers belie the true nature of this essential signified, this submerged subject. Here's a quote that I think is very illustrative of this point. Lucy Manette says this, almost unprompted. Darnay's talking to her, and she sort of just says this, and it's very interesting. Sometimes I've sat here of an evening until I have fancied, and here she breaks off, it will seem nothing to you. Such whims are only impressive as we originate them, I think. They are not to be communicated. So she has this thought, considers communicating it to Darnay, and says, it won't be the same as I think it. Once it's communicated, it will be mistaken in some manner. And I think more broadly we can say the signified self will never be perfectly represented in the signifiers of language. It will always be mistaken by others. So what we arrive at here is the futility of language, both at a diegetic level, as we see here with Lucy talking to Darnay, but also at a more broadly metatextual level. Dickens is conveying this to us, the reader, that language is sort of a futile exercise in communication. That's it. Those are my works cited. Thank you very much.